everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. I am starting to get ready for my next tournament, the first tournament of the year on Lake Okeechobee, only a couple of weeks away, really. Cannot wait to get down there. I am ready to leave the Wisconsin winter. As I look outside, it's a lot of snow, a lot of cold. Let's get to Florida. I wanted to talk about one of the techniques that I know will be a player down there, and that's punching heavy mats, whether that's cattails, round reeds, hyacinth, hydrilla. I don't really know what to expect at this point, especially since I haven't been there since the hurricane hit. But the reality is, it's Lake Okeechobee. It's fishing a giant swamp. So I figured I would talk a little bit about how to use the big weight and what you're looking for. These are 5 things that will help you become a much better angler at punching and using the big heavy weight to catch fish on a Texas rig. This is a time of year that the biggest females, no matter where you're at. So yes, I'm going to be in Florida and we're still iced over here in Wisconsin, but once the ice comes off and you're talking about pre-spawn to spawn period, the biggest females in the lake a lot of times will move in and use the thickest cover to stage to spawn. So they'll pull into an area that's a spawning area and they will get under these thick mats. So these mats are definitely some of the best places to look for catching the biggest bass in the lake. That's just how it is. Does not matter where you go. And the mats may vary. If you're talking about fishing highland lakes, maybe Lake Cumberland, or you're over on Table Rock, maybe you've got some of those sawdust mats where the waters come up and you have a bunch of just floating debris in the backs of pockets. You can go punch that stuff. It's all of the same. It really does not matter where you're at. What matters is finding the thickest cover that you can, using 1 ounce to 2 ounces, maybe even more in some places, to punch through and get to those big females that are holding underneath those mats, because the mats do several things. They provide them with a place to stage that they feel comfortable with because it's a heavily protected area. But those mats generally absorb sunlight, which produce heat, and therefore in cold fronts, the mats stay warmer. And in warming trends, when they're grabbing heat, they provide more warmth, and the females like that. They need to warm their eggs up in order to get into the spawning phase. So it's just a great place to look because it holds up in cold fronts, and generally speaking, it does very well as well in warming trends when the sun is out. So let's talk about 5 key things that you need to look for. These 5 things are like the keys to punching. This is a technique that I love. This is a technique that I do. And I think oftentimes people just say, there's a thick mat, I'm going to go punch that. And the reality is, if you're not in the right area, you're not going to catch a fish. You're not going to get a bite. So I want to point you guys in the right direction, show you where to go, things to look for, and to keep in mind when you're punching, because these are what are going to actually catch you more fish and get you more bites. The first one, and this is something that oftentimes does not get discussed, but I assure you the best punchers out there are fully aware of this, and this is the sun angle. So let's say you pull up to a mat. You're fishing a hyacinth mat in the middle of a big flat, right? The sun, depending on where you're at, is coming at an angle to your mat. So if you're going down this mat, flipping the edge, and you happen to have the sun behind your back, and it's at roughly a 45 degree, and you're in, say, 6 feet of water, that sunlight is penetrating under the mat, probably about 3 feet at that point. Meaning if you flip 1.5 feet into the mat, let it fall to the bottom, it's in the sunlight. The fish are going to be in the shade. They're going to be pushed back under that mat further in. So when that happens, you want to make sure you're flipping further than whatever that sunlight is penetrating under the mat. Same goes for the other way. If you're going down a mat and the sun's in front of you, that way you've actually got sunlight and shade that's coming out towards your boat further from the mat. So in those instances, sometimes the fish aren't even under the mat. They're out in front of it. And you may want to be throwing a moving bait or a soft stick bait in front of the mat because those fish are actually out from under the mat. It's something you really want to pay attention to. I can't tell you how often I've gone down a mat and I can see an angler in front of me, fishing in front of me, where they're flipping the edge. they're flipping 1 foot into the edge, and I'm sitting there going, that sunlight's penetrating 3, 4 feet under that mat. I go behind him, I'm flipping 5, 6, 7 feet further into the mat, catching fish, and they're not catching fish because they don't recognize that that sunlight is penetrating under the mat at an angle. It's a very important thing to recognize anytime you're flipping. The second, and potentially the most important thing in terms of setting up specifically where a fish is to identify that current is a huge factor. This current can be natural or it could be wind driven. And most of the time it's wind driven. But the reality is the current, and it doesn't even have to be windy out. This is one of the crazy things. When you fish a big lake, like a Lake Okeechobee, if you have a south wind, it blows wind to the north shore. When that wind stops, the water that rose on the north shore settles and will backflush back to the south end of Lake Okeechobee. This happens on big lakes all over the country. You just don't recognize it a lot of times. But when that happens, you may actually have no wind at all, but you've got current where it's flushing back to the other end of the lake. The point is, whether you have natural current or wind-driven current, the fish are going to set up in the places where these thick mats of vegetation, whether it's cattails or hydrilla or milfoil or hyacinth, funnels that current. So if you have a straight line mat that has one little bump out, that bump out is funneling the current, and that's going to be your high percentage spot. If you have two mats that maybe come together and you have 15 feet between them, those mats are funneling the current through. So the 2 points of those mats that are facing each other are going to be your high percentage places. And this is not just hyacinth. I mean, it does not matter. Like I said, it could be sawdust mats. It could be during the summer. You have big mats of floating grass debris that have been ripped up from who knows what, and it's piled up next to a dock or a seawall. The point is, you need to recognize your high percentage spot is almost always going to be where the current, natural or wind driven, is being pushed by the mat itself. That's the second thing. The third thing is you're almost always better off trying to find areas that have multitudes of grass coming together. So if you've got a big flat and the flat's got hydrilla in it, okay, there's nothing that separates where you should flip. Maybe you've got one little patch of cattails or round reeds in the middle of it. That's going to be your high percentage spot. Maybe you've got cattails, hyacinth, round reeds all coming together. All of those things coming together. The more mixture of grass species you have, generally provides a better area because that mixture is doing a couple things. It's telling you that there's a better bottom composition there that fits multitudes of plants, because in a lot of cases, your plants grow in specific bottom. If you've got just muck, you may have one type of weed. If you've got hard bottom, you may have round reed by itself. But if you have a multitude of plants, that means you've probably got a various bottom compositions, which is good, or you've got a good, solid, stable bottom composition that is good for almost everything, which means it's probably a good area for life in general, including bait fish, which includes game fish. The other thing a variety of grass does is it generally leads to a lot more openness and caverns in that area. So if you've got one giant flat of hydrilla, it could be choked out completely. When you got hydrilla that mixes in with cattails and round reeds and hyacinth, it creates a lot of holes, a lot of good ambush locations. So you're generally better off trying to find a multitude of plants that come together in one area. The next thing you want to recognize is the weather that you're having. Now, generally speaking, during the pre-spawn and spawn period, if you have a cold front, your thickest mats are great places to fish because the fish will pull to them. They'll move off the bed, pull to these areas because they retain heat. Now, a lot of people would say, well, if the sun's out, it's a great time too. And it is a great time as long as you're not truly in a very stable weather pattern during the spawn. Meaning, yes, they'll be there until they want to spawn, but you got to recognize that generally speaking, good sunny, stable weather conditions are great times for the fish to move to the bed too. So you'll run into some instances where your weather conditions are perfect and they move to spawn and therefore they vacate the mats. Now you need to recognize that on the water, but generally speaking, If you've got sunny conditions, the mats are good places for shade and they hold fish. But there are some caveats to that. If you've got warm, overcast conditions, a lot of times those fish will spread out and vacate those mats. So the weather is also very important. The last thing I'm going to point out is a mat is only a mat. It's got to be in the right area. Meaning, if you're in Florida, when I'm down there in February, you're going to need to find the mats that are in the areas that the fish are thinking about spawning in. If I find a good mat on the main lake, it's probably not going to hold up that well. Or I find a good mat that's in an area that's not ideal for spawning, they're probably not going to be any fish around. And this isn't just a spring thing. The same can be said for a lot of lakes like up here in the North Country. During the middle of the summer, you get a lot of floating grass that floats into areas. Well, if the lakes are big enough, you're talking about lakes like a Mill Locks. If you get a good grass mat floating up against the bank on the main lake, you're probably not going to have a largemouth there. Largemouth like to stay in the bays. Same thing goes for on the Great Lakes. There are good largemouth in the Great Lakes. They're generally not out on the main lake. They're generally in the bays. So if I find a good bay on one of those large lakes with a grass mat that floated up against the bank, probably a good place to look versus on the main lake. If I'm fishing a smaller lake up here around my house and, I go into some of the good spawning bays that may have a couple feet of water and find a great blown up grass mat against a bank, there's probably not going to be a fish under it because the fish have vacated those spawning areas in the summer and moved out to deeper offshore stuff on the main lake. So you need to recognize that the mat needs to be in the right place. So just because you find a mat does not mean there's going to be a bass under it. You need to first find the areas that the fish are going to utilize based on the season of the year, and then try to find those mats that are in that area because then they will hold fish. But a mat has to be in the right area for it to be productive. So hopefully these 5 things will make you a better, heavy grass punching fisherman with a big weight. Because I assure you, it's one of the best ways to catch big fish. It's one of my favorite ways to fish. Most people love to do it. So get out there and do it. Use these 5 things to really narrow down where you need to be doing it. Because again, this is a slow process. You don't get to cover that much water. So if you use these 5 things to narrow it down, you'll find the right place and catch more fish. If you like this video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and stay tuned. We'll have a new tip for you coming out tomorrow.